We're going to explore speculative fiction methodologies with their potential for reimagining ethical, communal, and sustainable futures. So first, let's talk about what design fiction is. Design fiction is a type of practice where designers create artifacts and enact scenarios with these imaginary artifacts in the close future. And they do this to address ethical issues or explore the potentials of some technologies. This practice of speculation is currently quite often used in more corporate settings with more corporate purposes. But it also can help us imagine secondhand and sustainable economies, especially if we get inspired in their material practices. And what I mean by material practices is the actual artifacts that they create to sustain the fiction, as well as the enacting of scenarios with these artifacts. And we're going to be doing some of that together. But preceding design fiction, we have some traditions and types of practices of futuring and fictioning that are more politically inspired. These are, for example, Afrofuturism, Black feminist futurism, Indigenous futurisms, Chicana futurisms, prefigurative futurisms. There's a host of them. So let's examine a few of them so that you have an idea of the kind of the inspiration of some of the projects we're going to be working with. So Afrofuturism is a cultural movement that combines science fiction, history, and fantasy to explore the African American experience and connect those from the Black diaspora with their African ancestry. And it addresses themes and concerns of the African diaspora through technoculture and speculative fiction, imagining liberated futures for Black life. Groundbreaking author Octavia Butler is a key figure within Afrofuturism, and she wrote stories that featured Black protagonists challenging social hierarchies of race, class, gender, paving the way for other non-white, cis, heteropatriarchal voices in science fiction. And Afrofuturism uses speculative fiction to resist the anti-Blackness of many systems that we live in, and to envision liberated futures for Black people, but also for everyone. This tradition of thought can be quite powerful as an inspiration when we're imagining how secondhand economies can serve as sites of resistance and reparation. Indigenous futurism and Chicana futurism emphasize the continuity of cultural and spiritual practices into the future. And sometimes this idea of the future doesn't necessarily apply in the same way for Indigenous futurisms. There are interesting ways of conceiving of time as non-linear, and in this sense, this kind of projection of the future as an ideal to work towards becomes problematic. But these perspectives help us also rethink time and our relationship to time, and embed decolonial practices to resist exploitation by envisioning these alternatives, ways of engaging with time in the future, where specifically Indigenous and Chicano communities thrive despite the historical and ongoing forms of oppression. And connected to these are decolonial futurity, and this involves reimagining futures that break away from colonial ways of being. This approach is about facing complicity in violence and unsustainability, and rethinking the relationship with modernity altogether and how it sustains ongoing colonial relationships. There are projects like the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures, that's GTDF. That's an arts research collective that uses experiments to deactivate the colonial habits and gesture towards decolonial futures. So we're going to be inspired by these speculative practices to reimagine how justice and infrastructure and secondhand economies can drive ethical and political transformations. So currently, from my observations, I've come to ask myself some questions that feel like ethical conundrums in secondhand that I wish to explore together with you this week. For example, the first one is that secondhand economies often perpetuate colonial exploitation despite the discourse of thrifting or secondhand being positive for the environment. So I believe that we should address how these practices could become ethical or sustainable by shifting overconsumption and capitalist structures rather than just extending consumer capitalism so that we address the systemic issues. Another conundrum is the increasing reliance on technology and automation within secondhand. Currently, for resellers and for people in secondhand economies, there is a strong reliance in systems like digital technologies that, as we saw, are often kind of populated by algorithms, machine learning, AI, and technologies that have these characteristics that make some of the work invisible, that create information asymmetries. And so I believe that these technologies can further perpetuate existing inequalities, but potentially we could also reimagine them in ways that would do the opposite, and would be ways of queering the systems or refusing these systems to imagine more equitable futures. For example, AI can streamline secondhand markets and maybe make them more efficient, but what would happen with the labor of resellers in that case? Also, what would it mean that it entrenches surveillance? Does it create further labor exploitation? Using the colonial and ethical lenses to think how to engage with these technologies is an aspect I want us to explore. Another conundrum is this flavor of community that I found in many secondhand and especially reseller communities. I'm interested in building communal relationships among resellers that could enhance their political unity and collective bargaining power, both with platforms and the state. Currently, I believe there's a very commoditized interaction between the quote-unquote reseller communities, and it would be interesting to see how we could imagine more communal relationships beyond these commoditized communities that exist currently. So this week, we're just going to integrate some of these speculative practices from Afrofuturism to reimagine secondhand economies as spaces for more liberatory futures or times or relationships.